The guiding questions for discussion. The first one with regard to the generation and assessment of climate risk information. In which area do you see the largest gaps and need for support in developing countries? What are the concrete actions that could be supported? The second question is the risk information readily available for the financial sector? If not, what can be done to better feed the risk information into lending and investment decision-making processes? The third one, where do you see concrete potential for a closer cooperation between local, regional, and national governments, and between national governments and private actors, such as infrastructure operators, investors, and insurers? The last one is questions that can be directed to participants in the audience. Could you share some information on best practices and experiences with regard to the screening of public sector infrastructure finance? The floor is open for those that would like to take it, ask questions, make comments, or just tell best practice or best lesson story to the audience. Yes, Katharina?
Just a question for Martina on the clarification. You were speaking about soft and hard infrastructure. Is that green and gray infrastructure, like nature-based solutions? Yes. Yeah, because I'm bringing this up again because I'm so excited about this topic of nature-based solutions, because it can be really a driver for business cases. And I just wanted to ask how the other panelists integrate that, or if there's more information needed on business cases, because we are working on a platform, the European platform on nature-based solutions and business case creation. I think this could be something that could be brought in here as a best practice example. It's very hard to do these business cases, as there are more than one beneficiary, and I'd like to have the opinion of the panelists.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, why not? It will be in French, and if need be for translation, we'll do.
Okay, so my question links with the second guidance question you have. You told us. It would be in French, because my English is really horrible. I'm sorry for that. Donc, voilà, moi je suis du secteur financier. Donc, ma question va être par rapport à l'investissement. Donc, nous savons très bien que les projets d'adaptation sont très importants. C'est un grand challenge, surtout pour le continent africain qui n'est pas vraiment émetteur et donc qui est beaucoup plus concerné par la problématique d'adaptation que par celle...
Est-ce qu'on traduit en même temps ou lorsque vous terminez? Do you need translation or is it okay? Non, pas pour si Mohamed, pour les autres. Is it okay? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. Et donc je disais qu'on est beaucoup plus confronté aux problématiques d'adaptation dans les différents NDC qui ont été présentés par les pays d'Afrique, le Maroc en tête. Nous avons un grand chapitre qui est dédié à cette problématique-là. On sait très bien qu'il y a beaucoup de fonds qui existent aujourd'hui, c'est beaucoup des banques multilatérales, des fonds comme le fonds d'adaptation. C'est une problématique qui est prise en charge par les gouvernements à travers directement leur budget ou à travers de l'endettement public. Mais les besoins sont tellement énormes que le secteur public en lui-même ne peut pas tout prendre en charge. Le secteur privé est également appelé à contribuer. Et c'est là où ma question se pose avec acuité. Comment amener des investisseurs privés qui, quelque part, ils ont besoin d'un retour sur investissement, à financer ce genre de projet en l'absence de visibilité réelle sur les outputs de ce genre de projet sur le plan économique et financier, en l'absence de mesures réelles, concrètes, que des investisseurs peuvent regarder pour pouvoir justement statuer sur le fait d'investir ou pas, etc. Est-ce que, je ne sais pas, hein, ma question elle est ouverte aux participants comme aux panélistes, est-ce que vous avez des cas concrets où des investisseurs privés, des banques privées par exemple, ont investi dans ce genre de projet et comment est-ce qu'ils ont fait? Merci.
Merci pour votre question. Last question or last intervention before giving the floor to the panelists to react.
Thank you. I'm Adam Preban from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Canada. My question is, I think it's mostly directed at Alfredo. First of all, thank you for using examples from Toronto and Canada. But my question maybe links to what you alluded to yesterday is, well, how can municipal governments or sort of subnational governments better access funding? I think you've mentioned that they have difficulty, and I'm wondering if you could expand upon that a little bit more. Do you see any cases where there's been sort of breakthroughs in this, or even recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, and well, I'll invite the panelists to react to those questions on the business case, on the private funding or for example, adaptation and resilience activities, and what are the outcomes with regard to potential return on investment. And of course, the last one directed to Alfredo, I don't need to recall it. Ladies first, I think, I hope.
Yeah, I would like most of it to comment on the first question, or yeah, first comment. Yes, so it's of course maybe a challenge to involve private sector in the green or soft adaptive measures, but I would like just to, for example, explain you how it was conducted in the case of Georgia. NGO was coordinating this activity of reforestation. As I said before, there were a little bit of problems, for example, in the baseline data. So then at the end, what could be done was a little bit less optimal than what it was planned. But in the private sector, in that case, was involved in buying seeds for the plants. And also in this case, we can see an inter-actor coordination because, for example, people were used at the local level to plant trees, and the women were also used to prepare the soil for tree planting, and as I said, the ONG was overall coordinating these activities in coordination also with the local municipalities for the selection of certain lands, and of course local consultation were made beforehand. So it's still a challenge, but in some small cases can be done.
James?
Sure, thanks for the questions. I'll respond to the first one on nature-based solutions. In some of our investments that we're looking at, this has come up. So for roads investments, dealing with erosion, a nature-based solution can often be the most cost-effective measure. Instead of building a big retaining wall, you can manage the erosion using lower costs, upfront cost measures, but it requires maintenance, extra maintenance, and it's a different approach. The question is, how do you know when to apply that method or the big wall? And it's quite a technical question. I mean, it requires expertise, it requires local knowledge, it requires understanding what the potential flood events might be, the rain events, and I think a new kind of development that's been happening over the last few years to help sort of understand what are the best practices is the emergence of industry-led best practice guidelines, sector-led, industry-led best practice guidelines. For example, the PIARC, the International Roads Association, They have already published some guidelines on how to deal with climate change adaptation, and this is happening in other sectors, the port sector, there's PIANC, Hydropower Association, IHA also is doing the same thing. And this is really a basis for, I think, the entry point for introducing such solutions. So, guiding people on the field that, are new to the topic or trying to understand how to deal with this to say, okay, consider these other options that may be lower upfront costs. First, if they work, this is what's involved. And if it doesn't work, then you have to think about more hard infrastructure options. And through those, let's say, best practice guidelines, that's also where us as financiers can, engage on these topics, because, these are quite complex technical questions. And, the core business of a financing institution is to, make loans, obviously, or equity. The core business is, let's say, something else than assessing the climate risk of a slope for a road over the next 50 years. It's just, that the expertise is not necessarily there, but through these guidelines, it's a way for us to say, okay, did you follow that process and consider these technologies? And ultimately, if these guidelines can feed into a standard, so there's the ISO 14090 standard on framework standard on adaptation. If in the long term or medium long term that these guidelines are adopted as international standards, then that could be a really strong basis for guiding decisions in terms of the technical aspect.
Mohammed. Alfredo.
Thank you. I think. Well, I'll try to address first the soft versus hard adaptive measures, but in terms of feasibility and other things, in the end, I'm going to end up also addressing how to access funding for these measures. Obviously, we want to have the best solution for cities, and each city has a very different geology, climate regime, and we can't really go and tell the city like Dubai to implement green infrastructure to address heat, because they just don't have the water for it. So we need to think of other solutions. And then this is kind of like a case-by-case scenario, where in some cases green or soft adaptive measures are really not feasible. But in general, we try to do that. And yesterday they were also mentioning how in Ethiopia they have been implementing this drainage system under the highways. I had a chance to go and see that in Addis Ababa. What they didn't mention is that they started doing that, then they stopped at some point because we connected Addis with Copenhagen and other cities as well, and the city of Copenhagen through the University of Copenhagen and the University of Addis. They started exchanging information, and they said, look, this hard infrastructure solution is good, but you have all the ingredients to have actually a really good soft adapted measure, improving your parks and cleaning up the river that goes through the city and actually making it habitable, usable for citizens instead of being the place where they dump stuff. And I got to see before and after pictures, and I got to see the river actually clean on the way to becoming something actually better, with parks on the sides and maybe restaurants and other things, and to bring life to the city, but also to be used as a self-adaptive measure. And this worked perfectly for them. I know that the hard infrastructure solution that brings the water to the other neighborhoods is great, and it works great. And in combination with these soft adaptive measures, what Addis did is it's greening up the city and making it a better, more habitable place for everyone, but also it's absorbing so much of the water that wasn't being absorbed before. So in these cases, sometimes green solutions also, right now, City of Rio de Janeiro is trying to see how they can implement these kind of solutions in a new area of the city towards the west that has been recently opened to the city. It was just too difficult to get there, traffic jams, just one road, and you had to go like super long way. But because of the Olympics, they built a tunnel, and a new BRT line that goes all the way there. So suddenly this area becomes of interest to developers. But the city first needs to implement some measures there because it's a flood-prone area, and where they want to build is literally where it floods every year. So they're starting to do like new urban planning in the area, move this developing area a little bit to the sides, and use that as a park, as an area that can absorb all the water and harvest and collect all that water, then can go to the ocean. But using this idea of, okay, you will have a park here. You won't have all this land to build, but you will have park. That means you can have restaurants. That means the land value goes up. And then the city of Rio is looking to finance some of these measures through the construction companies. And in terms of how to access funding for these measures, not only the case of Toronto, but in many other cities. And sorry, I just speak about cities is how we focus our work. I can't talk about national level policies, I'm afraid. But it's pretty much the same. And we have been talking about like the lack of information, the lack of data, how cities have been able to breach this lack of information. And on the website where you see the program for this forum, there is also a link to the interdependencies report I was talking about. It's short and really easy to read, and I'll encourage you to take a look. We are looking into expanding this report, including more cities, just because we saw that because they got engaged in this research, they really went and changed things in their own municipalities. They changed things. They created working groups and things that didn't exist before. Toronto is actually starting a new research on their own about interdependencies and really high-level risk assessment to go deep into every little system. But how do you fund all of this? In some cases, cities like Melbourne, they manage to work with insurance companies. This is kind of like a taboo topic. Cities are not really comfortable working or not working with insurance companies because they don't know what to expect. Are they going to raise the primes because they know more now about the city? Not really, because they already know more than the city. But what they need to do is to connect and to help each other out like that. And financing through these institutions, improving neighborhoods through resilience strategies. Even in Melbourne, they managed to lower the primes in some buildings that were implementing resilience strategies. So this is also a way of funding these different projects.
Thank you, Alfredo. And if you want to have development, we need to have communication and access in our best way to access and have communication in our cities, towns, and so on. And if you want to fight against climate change, we need to have access to funding and finance. I thank the panelists, and I thank all the participants to this session.